Hey, folks, greetings and welcome from the Offensive Security Group at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. So, it's Friday, and we're super excited to share this stuff with you. For those of you that are new, every week, our offensive security team here is tracking, researching, analyzing, kind of keeping our hands on the pulse of the security community. And, we're here to talk about that and kind of step through some of those things. Hopefully, you'll find some of this interesting. And today you've got me, Brad, and Spencer, who says your name says Brad, by the way, on the screen. So you got two Brads, but one of them is actually Spencer.
Watch this magic.
And
Ready?
can you do it?
Ready? 3, 2, 1. Hey, there
Nice,
we go.
nice. It's almost like you did that on purpose. So cool, man. So just to kind of run down some of the topics we're going to talk about today, we got a pretty good list going. So we're going to talk about PDF malware, right? PDF malware is pretty old school stuff, but it's still around and it's still active. And there's some new tricks that we're going to talk about today. Talking about rogue Azure subscriptions. That's an interesting conversation for those of you who are, already in the cloud or heading that way. We'll talk about the incident that's kind of infamous at this point and a little bit funny. Somebody modifying a pretty widely known PHP vulnerability or PHP library, sorry. And then we'll talk about the Verizon data breach investigative report, which is fantastic source of information. We love it, and we're going to talk about that. Zoom has a remote code execution flaw or series of flaws, and then a VMware bug that now has a proof of concept. So with all that said, Spencer, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure. So the first one is PDF malware. There was some interesting research by the team at HP. They did some analysis of an infection chain that eventually led to the snake keylogger. And they've done additional research on this. There's other groups like Fortinet that have done research on the snake keylogger as well. This has been around for a while, a number of years. So nothing new in the sense of the malware. However, the technique and the infection chain that led to it, I thought was interesting and worth calling out and talking about. So the infection chain starts with an Adobe file that has a, when you open it, has a Adobe file prompt. And the threat actor was fairly tricky in that they modified the name of the file. They changed the name of the file to kind of fit into the prompt in order to trick users. So they called it the name of the file they named it was has been verified. However, PDF, JPEG, XLS, docx, and that's in quotes. So what it looks like is the Adobe prompt is verifying the authenticity of this file that it wants to open. And if you just look at it quick, it's like, yeah, the file's been verified, all good to go. And then you just click open, and then it launches the next stage. So I thought it was a pretty interesting lure, a pretty interesting trick. And I mean, I personally, I click through prompts all the time, right? That's what we do. Like, we see a prompt, we hit OK. It's pretty tricky to spot. So I thought this one was interesting to call out. And there's a couple lessons from it that I think are interesting and worth sharing.
I love it, man. What is old is new, right? Because
Yep.
we used to see a lot of these in the late 90s, early 2000s of, messing with the verbiage of the prompts. And so it's kind of surprising to me that Adobe is still kind of, allowing their prompt to be played a little bit. So, but it's
Yeah,
cool.
and PDF documents typically, if they're not super suspicious or contain a lot of malicious code or anything like that, PDF documents tend to get delivered, right?
Yeah.
We exchange PDF documents all the time through email. So it's more likely it'll be delivered. And then the follow-on activity was like a maldoc or something like that, that, may or may not get detected. But, the takeaway here for me is just being aware of the prompts. Because like you said, what's old is new again. And threat actors they'll try things that have been done before and continue to work. So yeah, tried and true.
It is, yeah. And so in my previous life, I worked in the financial sector for a long time. We had a basically a tool that would explode any attachments. So a copy of the attachment would be made, it would be dropped out into a VM environment, a sandbox environment, and then it would be ran and then analyzed. And to my knowledge, that is the most effective defense against this. It's also not cheap. So,
Yep.
there are other mitigative strategies that you can use, but users are the first line of defense for
Yep.
sure.
And something that we're going to talk about later on in this episode is the DBIR. The DBIR calls out email and web apps as being some of the two highest, infection vectors still to this day.
Yeah.
Anything that's exposed on the internet or any way that a threat actor can directly communicate with your users is going to be an avenue of attack. So
Yeah.
anything you can do to help mitigate that, like the sandboxing and the detonating
Yeah.
documents, goes a long way.
Agreed.
Awesome. So I think that's it for that one.
Mhm.
The next story I thought was really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it's Azure. A lot of things are moving to the cloud. We do pen tests and we see these kinds of things. So there's some couple interesting takeaways from this for me, and it was interesting research. So the team at Inviso observed how phishing campaigns resulted in a compromised user creating additional attacker infrastructure in an Azure tenant. So by default, users can create new subscriptions in Azure unless you restrict it. And by default, even global admins don't really have good visibility into that. So they did some research and they observed some phishing campaigns where attackers were phishing a user. They were standing up additional infrastructure to further their attack on that organization or maybe another organization and kind of mask their activity. So I thought that was interesting both from attack and defending perspective. Something I'll look for on pen tests, when I do them,
Yeah.
and something that as defenders we can kind of identify and hopefully turn on additional monitoring and protections for this.
I like this for a lateral movement in a red team exercise, by the way, because, you're going to have whitelists for, trusted tenants. If I can spin something up in a VPC or, there's so many different opportunities for abuse here once you get a foothold inside of someone's Azure environment, which is not terribly difficult because as you mentioned, there's a lot of default things that allow regular users to do spicy stuff.
Yep.
So yeah, that's super cool. And I think we were talking with Darius before we got on here, and he brought up that CASB solutions are really, going to be a good strategy for addressing this. Again, not cheap and not easy,
Yep.
um, but you've got some other mitigations here too that are pretty interesting.
Yeah, and like I said, one of the key takeaways for me on this is just like on-prem Active Directory, the defaults are just the beginning, right? The defaults are
Right.
rarely optimal when it comes to security, and it requires us to, as defenders, to tune and configure that environment and identify these things. But yeah, in terms of mitigations, there are you can restrict management group creation. So working, to configure a model of least privileged is a really good idea. You can restrict subscription creation, and you can restrict subscriptions from switching Azure AD directories. So it's more of
Mhm.
like a governance thing. So there are mitigations for this to kind of restrict these subscription creations. And then, of course, you can also and should configure subscription logging and alerting so that you know when things are getting created, whether it's by an IT person on your team and it's a valid thing and they're setting up infrastructure for a project, or if it is potentially malicious. It's a good idea in both situations.
Yeah, agreed. Part of a more broad campaign of change management and
Yep.
um, you know, tracking assets and things of that nature. So yeah,
Yeah,
cool.
absolutely.
I like this next story.
Yeah,
It's funny.
the next one's interesting. This is something that broke earlier in the week. And I call it a surprising turn of events, and really it's not super surprising when you understand what kind of transpired. But the TLDR of this is earlier in the week there was a Python library and a PHP library that was hijacked, right? Repo hijacking is what it's called. But there was these libraries that were hijacked, and some people pointed out that they were sending environment variables to this Heroku instance,
Yeah. The
this
Heroku app. Yeah.
this Heroku app, and it was sending AWS keys specifically. And everybody was, like in the security community was kind of questioning this and thought it was something, nefarious or malicious against these libraries. Turns out it was a security researcher.
Mhm.
You know,
Air quotes, security researcher.
yeah, air quotes for sure. And
Yeah.
The TLDR of this is, they released a blog post this researcher did and said this was not malicious and they were just trying to prove a point. But kind of an example of how not to do security research. There's other ways, right, to prove a point than sending AWS keys to an environment. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
So, I would also say if I got caught doing something super sketchy that I was just doing research, right? That's exactly what I would say because it's the easy
Yep.
way to just kind of get out of it. But as others have pointed out, there were unlimited amount of opportunities to do something other than steal AWS keys,
Yep.
you know? And so, anyway, I was actually looking over their blog or whatever, and everything about it is sketchy, right?
Mhm.
This person claims that, well, I put a report on GitHub and HackerOne, but I closed it as a duplicate. Why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense at all. So anyway, the whole thing is super
Yep.
sketch, and yeah, that's not how security research is done, by the way.
Yep. For sure. For sure. But it does point to a larger issue, right? Repo hijacking, compromising these libraries that are very commonly used is something that has been done before in large scale attacks.
Yes.
That is actually malicious, and it points to a larger issue that we need to be aware of, especially if we do software development, especially if we're using projects and libraries from places like GitHub. If we're including things directly from GitHub, we need to be aware that these things are a possibility. And it's sometimes as simple as just registering a domain for an author that had their domain expired, right? They're an author of a
Mhm.
project, their domain expired, and now I register an email and I take over that repository.
Sure.
So it does point to a larger issue that we need to be aware of and be mindful of it and have protections in place for.
Mhm. Yeah. No, I agree. And, this also kind of illustrates the need for proper development workflows. One of the things that we do at Security 360 is, we call curated DevSecOps, and it's the idea of auditing the app, tracking it through its life cycle, understanding what libraries are in use, and then monitoring those libraries to see if they change. And so, there's an entire process around preventing this from happening, but in my experience, it's like 1% of the world is following is following that suggestion. It's a very uncommon for
Yep.
organizations, and there are even entire companies out there who make their living on auditing open source libraries
Yep.
because it is such a problem across the
Yeah.
board. So, yeah, so there are a lot of cool lessons learned from this, but also just don't be that guy.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. And this will be something that continues to be an issue
Yeah,
until places like GitHub put additional protections in place.
yeah.
It shouldn't be that easy, right, to compromise a library by just re-registering a domain name. There should be
Oh yeah, for
some
sure.
additional protections in place for some of these libraries, or maybe they have to get verified or something to get those protections. But things like npm and PHP and Python, the bigger libraries of those for those languages,
Yeah.
should have some additional protections in place, and maybe
Oh
we'll
yeah.
see that coming in the future.
Yeah. Hope so. For sure.
Well, the next one is a topic that I'm particularly interested in. It's
Mhm.
the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. It's something I make time to read every year. I think there's a tremendous amount of valuable information in there. It's grown over the years. I think in 2008, it started at something like 500 breach investigations, and they're now, I think it's over 5,000 if I remember right.
Wow.
5,000 breaches and 23,000 security incidents, almost 24,000 security incidents that are part of this research. So really good information, a wealth of data, and it really helps put some context around what we're seeing on a day-to-day basis and provide some, data-driven real world views on what's commonly affecting companies.
Yeah.
Couple notes that I took away, or a couple takeaways I had from this that I thought were especially interesting, were going back to what we just talked about, right? Supply chain in the DBR. Supply chain was responsible for 62% of system intrusions. So their
That's like
categories.
unprecedented, right? Like, I don't think we've ever seen a number that high.
Yeah, and with SolarWinds and with these packages and these popular libraries being compromised, this is becoming to be a real big issue. Just last year, a couple of years ago, this was just a blip on the radar, and now
Right.
it's a very big thing. So that stands out to me because of the story we just talked about and the SolarWinds issue. Kaseya, all those situations, all those cases make for a compelling argument to pay attention to supply chain much more closely.
Mhm. Definitely.
Another interesting tidbit I thought was according to the DBIR, the vast majority of breaches include just a handful of steps. So phishing, downloader, and ransomware is what they put.
Yeah.
And what that means to me is if we can interrupt that process, if we can make the attack chain last longer, make the attacker perform more steps, then they have more chances to get detected, right? There's more chances
Right.
for us to find them and kick them out.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting that they called that out and said the vast majority of breaches were just a handful of steps.
Yeah. And every one of those steps, by the way, has a very well established process and tooling for prevention. So, you really have to be missing some pretty big steps in a lot of cases,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. So I guess what I'm trying to say is you have a lot of opportunity there,
Yep.
even though there's only those 3 steps.
Yep.
So
Yeah, and just extending that attacker cycle or that attack chain goes a long way. And it
Sure.
speaks to the next point that I had too, is ransomware went up 13% this year, which is not really surprising, but it
Yeah.
is kind of, right, that we're still struggling to deal with ransomware. This still, it continues to be an issue. And according to the DBIR, it represented 25% of the breaches that were investigated as part of the report.
Yeah.
So not an insignificant amount.
Yeah.
And it's something that is expected. I don't think anyone expected ransomware breaches to go down, but to
Right.
go up by that amount is pretty significant, I think.
No, I agree. And it's interesting that like you said, we're still dealing with this at the rate that we are, because over the last, I don't know, probably 5 or so years, when I talk to decision makers and executives, and you ask them, what is your number one concern? What are you the most scared of? What keeps you up at night? It's ransomware. It's
Mhm.
ransomware for all of them. And you have to imagine, if ransomware is at the top of everybody's list, that they're putting all these protections in place. But with that said, I do think there has been an increase in like EDR, because just 2 years ago, on internal pen testing, we would see maybe 20% having EDR, and
Yeah.
now it's what, 80, 90? What would you estimate?
Yeah, I would say most of our clients that we're pen
Yeah.
testing now have an EDR,
Yeah.
and if not, they have an antivirus product that has some similar features with EDR. So
Right.
like tamper protection is becoming more and more popular with antivirus products that it
Yeah.
wasn't in the past. So there's some features that are carrying over to antivirus from the EDR world. But yeah, I would say probably most of our clients have EDR now.
Yeah,
So
I agree with that. So there is an evolution taking place, and I just wonder if, maybe this ransomware number will start going down. The
yep.
problem is it's evolving now.
Yep.
We're seeing ransomware, and I don't want to burn up too much time on it, but we're now seeing ransomware that's more extortionware,
Mhm.
where they're exfilling the data and holding on to it in exchange for,
Yeah.
um, for the money. So I
Yep.
don't know. I don't know. But
Yep.
the fascinating thing, I think we could talk for
Yep.
an hour just on ransomware and what to do
Yeah.
about it and why
Yeah.
it is what it is. But yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. And something we want to have a separate podcast to cover is ransomware is also the DBIR. I think another episode to cover some of the other takeaways from the DBIR and what to do about it and how to take that and translate it to your security program and things like
It's a good
that
idea. I like it.
is another good episode that we plan to do.
Mhm.
The two other kind of bullet points that I wanted to talk about with this DBIR report this year is it has to do with basic web apps, has to do with bad IP addresses. And the first one is, according to the DBIR, 0.4% of the IP addresses that attempted remote code exploits or remote code execution weren't seen in one of the prior phases of like scanning and searching for these vulnerabilities on the internet. In other words, a far majority of the scanning activity and the exploitation activity going on the internet is stuff that's been seen before, been seen doing bad things before. And a very
Yeah.
small percentage, according to this, has not been seen before. So it's like blocking bad IPs is a really good thing. It's something we knew, right? But it just emphasizes the importance of having good intelligence and having a good feed of known bad stuff going on and just blocking it proactively.
Yeah. That's awesome, by the way, that they're bringing attention to that, because it is one of my kind of big influencers early in my security career. Um, his name's Mike, and he would always say it's the blocking and tackling that gets you. It's the basics, right? Like blacklisting known bad IP addresses.
Yep.
That's a blocking and tackling thing. And in this case, what we're saying is that would have caught or prevented nearly all
Mm-hmm.
of the breaches in this report. That is an astounding thing to take away from this, in my opinion.
Yep. Yep, for sure. And services like Gray Noise, and there are others that help isolate the noise. I think that's one of
Yeah.
Gray Noise's taglines is filtering out the noise on the internet to help you block those things and mitigate those attacks. So
Yeah.
really, really interesting point from
Good stuff,
from
man.
the
I like it.
The last one for this is again in the report, it called out that 80% of the breaches in the basic web application attacks pattern. So the DBR has patterns. 80% of those basic web app attacks can be contributed to stolen credentials.
Mhm.
So it says in the report, which is kind of funny, and there's a lot of humor in the DBR. So if you haven't read it,
naturally,
I encourage you to read it. There's a lot of humor in it, which makes it very much more digestible. But stolen creds and web apps go together like peanut butter and chocolate.
Yeah.
I love peanut butter and chocolate, and when we were doing pen tests, we love credentials, and we love them to get into web apps and get a foothold. But pretty astounding number that 80% can be attributed to stolen creds.
I will tell you, and this isn't necessarily a secret or anything, but we use stolen credentials in every external penetration test that we do. So part of our reconnaissance process is to see if you have any compromised accounts on the dark web. We grab those and we try to log in with them. And this year, on a few occasions, that has led to, and you were actually on that engagement in January, where we got domain admin from a set of credentials we found that were 5 years old.
Yep.
Right. And so it happens. And it's unsurprising to me that this statement was made, because it's literally part of our TTPs, man. And it works,
Yep. And finding this stuff is, you can subscribe to things like Have I Been Pwned? You can subscribe your company to services like that. That's a good idea to get notified if your company's domain is identified in a breach. There's other services that you can use, but the takeaway here is credentials are one of the most important things, and protecting those, making sure that you understand your attack surface is really important. So some big takeaways for that, and from us as pen testers and attackers, simulating attackers, it's important, and us for defenders, there's important takeaways as well.
It's good stuff.
Cool.
All right, so I think this next one's mine. Zoom. Um, the reason that I wanted to include this is not because this particular vulnerability is super savage. It's really more about the takeaways from the attack path and also considering context. I knew this one was going to generate some interest because I mean everybody knows Zoom, right? Most people probably use Zoom on a day-to-day basis. Um, and or at least once a week meeting with vendors, whatever it is. So anyway, Google's Project Zero found an attack path that would allow an attacker to send a message to another Zoom client, and through a series of events execute shellcode, right? So basically just load whatever they want on there, and it required no user interaction. So on the surface, it's like, oh no, everybody uses Zoom. Here's an RCE exploit that doesn't require any user interaction. That's a big deal. And yeah, but in context, the attacker has to be able to send the victim a message. Okay, so that means you got to be in the Zoom meeting or have some type of mechanism by which you have communicated with them in the past, or basically you got to know them or know how to get them on a Zoom meeting. And then you also have to set up a man in the middle server that allows the attacker to force the client to update using a malicious binary. Those are hefty lifts, right? Maybe not standing up the man in the middle server, but um, you know, it's not an easy thing to do. The vulnerability is actually because of the way that Zoom processes XML. There are two XML parsers, and they're two completely different ones, and they process the actual XML differently. One of them does like a character by character. The other one I think is like byte by byte, whatever it is. But this relies on multiple flaws that exist both in VM or in Zoom's servers and in the Zoom client. Zoom, of course, has patched all this stuff, and presumably, although I don't know for sure, has patched the servers as well. And a patch
Yeah.
at any one of these points, whether it's the victim or the server, will solve the problem. So interesting, fascinating. Yes, I love these like super complex attack paths, but I don't think this is going to be something that gets weaponized,
Yeah.
or it's probably already broken in a
Yeah.
production environment. So
Yeah, it kind of sounds like one of those action movie things where like the
yes,
guy's on the keyboard and it's like, yeah, let me hack this thing, and then they send this thing, and it's like all this cool stuff
right,
happening, and then like
yeah,
their computer explodes and like blows up the room or something, and it's like
yeah. No, I completely agree. So it's pretty neat. I wouldn't expect this to be, if it was going to be around for a while, maybe, sophisticated attackers like nation state stuff. I think this is already fixed. So
yeah, nice, cool. Yeah, I think that's the last one, and it
it
has to
is.
do with VMware. So VMware issued a security advisory on May 18th, and it indicated that there were several products that were affected by multiple vulnerabilities. Two, in fact, and one of them was an authentication bypass vulnerability, which is CVE 2022-22972. There's also a local privilege escalation vulnerability, and it impacted a number of different products, including VMware Workspace ONE and Identity Manager and vRealize, etc. There's a handful of products here that it affected. And kind of the short story long of this is the vulnerability for this particular bug is that it allowed the host header. You could change and modify the host header such that the application would attempt to connect and authenticate to whatever you put in the host header. So fairly trivial vulnerability, fairly trivial bug. The team at Horizon 3 wrote another great article, a technical summary and root cause analysis essentially of this vulnerability. They looked at the patch and the code, and ultimately they created a POC for it. And that POC is making its rounds, obviously, on the internet. And Gray Noise, we've mentioned them a couple times in this episode. They passed that POC off to Gray Noise so that they could create some detections ahead of time for this. Rapid7 also has a good analysis of this and kind of puts a nice bow on it in terms of what they expect the impact to be, which kind of grounds this particular vulnerability, because it does affect a number of products. It's making its rounds on the internet. It's this unauthenticated, auth bypass thing. It looks pretty scary, and it can be, rightfully so. The researchers at Rapid7, however, have kind of an interesting take on this in that they don't think widespread exploitation is going to happen, due to a couple things. One, the VMware management port is not typically exposed on the public internet.
Right.
Kind of like that big IP issue that we were talking about last week. These management things, these management ports, these interfaces for these products aren't typically exposed to the internet. And if they are, chances are somebody's already poking at them, right? And you already know about it. The other thing with this is that at the time of this vulnerability, there was another vulnerability, CVE 2022-22954, that affects apparently the same products. It's easier to exploit, and it grants access to the operating system instead of the web application. So in other words, there's another vulnerability that's easier and better and gets you better access than this one.
Sure.
So although this is cool and it's fairly trivial, hopefully we don't see widespread exploitation of this or the other one for that matter. Hopefully we won't see widespread exploitation of either. But we do see some activity on Gray Noise. You can go and look. We see some stuff happening there. And at the core of it, there's workarounds, but the core mitigation is just to fix it and not expose those things to the internet if you can avoid it.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm going to go back to that blocking and tackling statement earlier, right? Don't put your admin interfaces and your core infrastructure components on the public internet. So, for those of you who are following along episode to episode, you're going to hear us say that over and over and over again, right? Yep. Blacklist IPs, keep your admin stuff off the internet, have a WAF, have a firewall, do analysis on email attachments. And there's just this really short list of things that you can do that will flat out nuke the vast majority of the things that we're going to spend 30 minutes every week talking about. So, just a little bit of work on the front end will really go a long way. So,
yeah, definitely.
So that's it then. Thanks for joining us this week. And if you like the content, please, like, subscribe, check us out on offsec.blog. If you want to follow along there as well, we're going to be putting out some really cool stuff in the near future for there as well. So that's all we have for you. Have a great weekend.